Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome both to those of you joining us in person and also remotely, as we normally do. This is our first in-person seminar from Schwartz Reisman, and it's being held at the University of Toronto Faculty Club. For those who don't know me, my name is Sheila McElraith. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Sciences, Candidacy for AI Chair at the Vector Institute, and also Associate Director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Before we begin today, as we always do, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. These and other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island developed complex and effective governance systems based on respect for all life and the intelligence of the natural world. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people who are working to reclaim their rights to self-determination and self-governance. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Although we may all be joining from different places today, for those of you who are joining remotely, we encourage you to reflect on the history and the relations of the land you live and work on. So the SRI seminar series has been active since the fall of 2020, and today's session is particularly special because it's our first in-person seminar event after several long years impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. As such, it's actually very fitting that our inaugural in-person seminar features the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society Director and Chair, Gillian Hadfield, who is a cornerstone of the Institute. Gillian is a professor of law and strategic management here at the University of Toronto, a faculty member at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and a senior policy advisor at OpenAI. Her current research focuses on innovative design for legal and regulatory systems for AI and also for other complex global technologies, computational models for human normative systems, and also Gillian works with machine learning researchers to build machine learning systems that understand and respond to human norms. Gillian's book, Rules for a Flat World: Why Humans Invented Law and How to Reinvent It for a Complex Global Economy, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And just last year, I guess, it was released as an audiobook. So that's my introduction of Gillian. Before I cede the floor to her, I just wanted to say that before we begin, just a reminder that this talk is being recorded for those of you who are here in person. We have our friends on Zoom as well. And Gillian will speak for about 15 minutes, and that will be followed by a Q&A. And Gillian will be handling the Q&A, so she'll either call on people in the audience, or also Gillian, for those of you who are joining remotely, Gillian will be watching the raise hands function, so please do that. Please raise your hands if you have questions. So that's it. My job is easy today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Gillian Hadfield, and we can all applaud.
Okay, thank you, Sheila, and thank you everybody for turning out in person, for showing up online. This is really quite a special moment. I'm really looking forward to our session, and I'm also really looking forward to having a chance to chat with people afterwards about this work and everything that we're doing at Schwartz Reisman. And so let me do this right off the bat, so if I don't miss it. Thank you to the Schwartz Reisman team for all the work that's been done. Are we good? Yeah. Technical difficulties. Of course, we're having technical difficulties. Anyway, thanks to the Schwartz Reisman team for putting this on, for all the work that's gone into both the seminar series and Sheila, your work this year on that, and everything we're doing at Schwartz Reisman. I know we also have some others who are associated with the Institute here with us today, and looking forward to connecting everybody. Okay, so this work that I am going to talk about today is not working. Is that working? Okay, there we go. I'm especially excited to be talking about this project. It's something I've been working on for quite some time, and it's also an example of what, at least for me, what I mean by interdisciplinary work. So this is the group I've been working with on this project, led by Aparna Balagappan, who's now, sadly, she was at I guess she's still at UT grad student. She's moved to MIT with Marcia Gassimi, who was, I think, still is a faculty affiliate with us. David Madras, I don't know if David's here. David was a grad fellow with us at Schwartz Reisman and now a graduate affiliate, I think. David Yang, who was a master's student in computer science at U of T. And then this guy over here, my co-author and son, who is a computer scientist studying AI and AI safety at MIT. But this was a true interdisciplinary effort. Okay, let's see, can I go back on this? There we go. Okay, so I want to talk about the context of automated decision systems, which we've already seen lots of conversation about automated decision systems, machine learning models that are rendering decisions. We've heard lots of talk about them in the context of credit markets, employment, education, and the ... there is to say we are going to start to see them kind of throughout the economy. One of the things I always emphasize when I talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning is it what economists call a general purpose technology, which means it's like electricity. We're going to be using it just about everywhere. An automated decision, automating human decisions is something that we're going to see throughout the economy as we already are. It also came to the fore and has played a significant role in the world of responsible and fair machine learning and artificial intelligence work. When the GDPR came out in 2018, specifically addressed the content. This seems like ancient history now, 2018, by the way. But when the GDPR came out in 2018, specifically addressed automated individual decision-making and established what came to be known as a right to an explanation for the decisions that come out of automated decision systems. And so this is so tiny, even I can't read it. Apologies for that. But in addition, this is part of what it's saying here is that in addition to providing information about the data being processed, which is what most of the general data protection regulation is addressing, also said that subjects who are people who are the subject of an automated decision are entitled to meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significant and the envisaged consequences of this processing for the data subjects. This became known as the right to an explanation. And so we also got the birth of sort of significant amounts of work in computer science around explainable AI. And that's one of the contexts for my work in thinking about this is to think about what do we mean by an explanation? Is that what this is calling for? What do we mean by an explanation? Canada has also just introduced proposed legislation, which also introduces a right to an explanation for automated decision making. So Bill C-27, proposed legislation, which I think actually as of today or yesterday, you could read some about on the SRI website, defines automated decision systems, any technology that assists or replaces the judgment of human decision makers through the use of a rules-based system, regression analysis, predictive analysis, machine learning, deep learning, a neural network, or other techniques. So this is exactly the idea of we're going to use machines to exercise judgment, and that's going to be at the core of what we're talking about today. And then must be able, the organization doing this must be able to provide individuals with an explanation of a prediction, recommendation, or decision. And the explanation must indicate the type of personal information that was used, the source of the information, and the reasons or principal factors that led to the prediction, recommendation, or decision, which is an enormous request for what we're going to produce for our automated decision systems. That's why I wanted to emphasize that we're going to see these in so many different domains, so many different contexts, understanding what we mean by producing explanations, reasons for decisions. What does that look like when we're automating it? The examples I just gave you were mostly in the private sector, credit, employment, education, et cetera. But we're also seeing automated decision systems arising in the public sector. So we're looking at systems that are being developed to address immigration, public benefits, tax decision. There should really be a ... and just the general adjudication in the public sector of the application of rules and regulations. So this is from a study that was, I'm hoping it's big enough for you to see. This is from a study done by a group at Stanford, primarily at Stanford. Did a sample of cases in US administrative agencies to see where they were using automated decision systems. The graph on the left is showing you the number of use cases that they found. This is not, they didn't get the whole population of what's out there. This was the sample that they drew. But when they took a look, they found close to 35 examples in law enforcement. That's the far left bar there. And then going through health, financial regulation, and other things down to education. The table up on the right here is showing us the top 10 agencies and sub-agencies, and number 1, the Office of Justice Programs and Securities and Exchange Commission, and then down to Customs and Border Protection. And then looking at in the lower right here, what are the types of governance tasks that's being automated? So we're seeing everything from regulatory research, analysis, and monitoring to enforcement, public services, adjudication at the bottom there. So again, and these are also early days for the implementation of automated decision, but you can already see it's kind of being explored and deployed across the board and in decision-making settings. So the question that frames this work is to think about this question about how should we train machines to make normative judgment? What's the best way to do that? How should we approach that path? If we're going to build systems to exercise judgment, there is still a question of should we do that at all? But if we're going to do it, how should we do it? So I want to think about, well, let me actually just go back here and just define my language here. So when I say normative judgment, I mean a decision where we have on a normative rule that says either you should or shouldn't do something. So government should or shouldn't pay benefits to this person. This person should or shouldn't be adjudicated to have violated this criminal statute. They should or shouldn't get bail, right? So it's different from a factual question. It's a normative question. It reflects our values about what we think is appropriate. And that's what I mean by the word normative here. So we're training for normative decision-making, normative judgment. So I want to think about sort of the paradigmatic case of machine learning, supervised machine learning, of image recognition, which of course was sort of going back to the explosion of machine learning, sort of the early days of demonstrating the capacity of big deep learning models to perform well in image recognition. Now this is a case where what we want to do is make a decision that maps the factual environment. So we want to predict what the ground truth is. Not the should or should not, but the is or is not, right? So just a reminder for some of you, I'm sure most of you know the way machine learning works, but for just to get us all on the same page, and we're looking at supervised learning, we're feeding into a network here, images, and the machine is learning by starting off making guesses about what's the right label to attach to that image, getting feedback when it gets it wrong, changing the model until it gets it right. And these things that it's trying to match, what it's trying to predict are the labels attached to the images in the training and test set. So we've got a set of images that have been labeled by humans to say, this is what this is. This is the ground truth of this image. So, for example, the CFAR 10 data set, one of the important early data sets here, big set of images with labels attached, airplane, automobile, bird. Here's another one, the celebrity A data set. It's celebrities not to identify who the celebrity is, but because there's a view that their pictures are fair game on the internet, but to do things like, okay, that's a pointy nose, that's somebody smiling, that's eyeglasses. But the idea that there's a truth, there's a ground truth, that is this person wearing eyeglasses or not, that we basically think that there's a correct answer to that question. Not just images, of course, we also have, for example, the IMDb data set. These are IMDb publishes public reviews of movies. So you can get annotators, labelers to go in and read the review and label it with things like, okay, was it a positive review or negative review? Because then you can build a model that will predict, do you think this will get a positive review or a negative review? This is the Stanford, okay, linguistic inference data set. I'm trying to remember what the SNLI stands for. Anyway, something like that. But this is basically taking bits of text. So here, you give the labeler 2 bits of text, and you say, label the relationship between those 2 bits of text. So this is to try and label for the meaning of these statements, where the labels are things like, there's no relationship, but you can't read the whole thing. The church choir sings and the church has crack, labeling that as neutral. Is it entailment? Is it implied? Is the second one implied by the first? Or is it a contradiction? Are those 2 sentences experiencing contradiction with an explanation? So generating those kinds of labels. And this business of labeling data sets, which are the raw material for that lot of machine learning tasks, if they're supervised learning, right, to generate all those labels, is a big business. Well, this is big, small business, or it's a big gig business, actually, probably the best way to think about it. So there's lots and lots of labeling that's happening with massive data sets around the world. I had the great fortune of spending some time at the Bellagio Center with Mary Gray, who wrote the book Ghost Work, really sort of looking at the ways in which there's a lot of human labor that lies behind the machine learning models that we're building and the AI we're building. And our own Gillian Posada, who's was also a grad fellow with us, I just noticed recently announcing a nice paper, the awards for his paper on looking at sort of the industry, the work of labeling in some Latin American countries. So it's lots of this work is going on. But the data sets are quite big, and we don't get a lot of labels per image. Even on, so the horizontal axis here is the number of items in the data set, and it's going up by factors of 10. So we're at billion at the far right here. That's the number of elements in the elements in the data set. And then the vertical axis, the number of labels per item. So that CFAR 10, 2 labels per item. The IMDb, the movie reviews database, that's 1 label per item. So that now becomes the ground truth that we train against, that somebody, one person, read that review and said that's a positive review or that's a negative review. A couple of examples, ImageNet with 10 labels per item, and civil comments, which we're going to talk a little bit about in this paper, with 10 labels per item. But it's still not very many. For the social scientists in the room, when you think about it, you've got a random sample, read this, how much are we going to easily agree? Even on things like, is that person smiling or not? Think about that celebrity A data set. So back to, how should we train machines to make normative judgments? Right? We've got our methods for training machines to make these factual predictions. How should we be training machines to make normative judgment? So we looked at, so how are we actually doing that? And the standard practice, and it's very hard to document the standard practice, by the way, because so much of the practice is inside private technology companies, and we don't have a lot of documentation or access to the procedures that are being used. But the standard approach is we have a normative rule, right? We have a rule like, if X, then Y. Collect those factual labels. So if these facts are true about the instance, then apply this judgment. If somebody hasn't paid their credit for the last, they're more than 3 months overdue on their credit, or if they've had a credit score below this level for this many months, if those factual conditions are true, then apply this judgment. Do or don't give benefits, do or don't give credit, decide whether or not they should get bail. So that is the rule is the structure of the way we think about a lot of our legal rules work. In these circumstances, judge that to be a violation. In these other circumstances, judge it not to be a violation. So this is a very natural procedure, since we've got all of these factual labels that have been collected, to then say, okay, so we've got those predictions, but is that person smiling? Is that a positive review or not? If you have a normative judgment to make, just apply that normative rule, that if-then logic, to the factual prediction. So build your model to predict facts, and then just apply the logic. If your model predicts that those facts are present, apply the logic, and then get your normative judgment out at the end. And that's the way most things are being done. So for example, in content moderation, we might have normative rules that say, if your comment uses toxic language, you're kicked off, it's deleted from, you violated the rules of the forum. So you can build a model, you can label your comments as toxic or not. You can get labelers to label comments as toxic or not. And then you predict those labels and then apply your rule. Exam proctoring, right? So your rule might be, if somebody's looking at a book during the exam, that's a factual circumstance. Label photographs or image clips from video as looking at a book or not. Make the prediction of looking at a book or not, and then apply your normative rule to that. We did find a paper about a construction site dress code, detecting factual features. We actually have lots and lots of labeled data sets about clothing, and that's why we actually decided to start there. Predict the features of the clothing, apply the rule, those features. Okay. One that many of us have heard about, the Compass recidivism prediction model, just to sort of relate that to something we've all probably heard about. The goal of building that system was to provide accurate predictions of particular facts, in particular to provide a prediction about the risk that a particular defendant or inmate would reoffend, to decide bail, to decide probation. Now, what then actually happens is you can get a labeled data set with description, feature facts about the person, and then a label of were they rearrested, because we have those labels available. So we've already made a little jump from what we intended to get at, which was offense, reoffense, and we've got rearrest, and built a model. Compass built a model to predict that the probability of rearrest. The way it's then been deployed is because we have rules like, as I've sort of quoted a bit from the Canadian Charter here, a person is entitled to, who's been charged, has the right not to be denied bail, or I guess you might say a right to bail, but they have a right not to be denied bail without just cause. One of the definitions of, let's just say just cause. One of the features that relate to just cause is the risk of reoffense. Okay, so again, how do you build it? You then predict that reoffense, or at least given the label, it's rearrest, and then apply the normative rule to that factual prediction. So that we originally had set out to study this question, a different question. We'd set out to study if an automated decision system is trained on labels collected from one set of humans, can another set of humans recover the reasons that justify the outcome? So remember what the Canadian law said. The Canadian law said somebody has a right, if they've been subject to an automated decision, they have a right to receive the reasons for that. But if the reasons were supplied by labelers at an early stage, we got to get reasons coming out at the other end. Can another group of humans? That's what we originally set out to study. And we thought we were just running a baseline case to see in really obvious cases where it was clear there was a violation, could somebody look at a clear violation and recover the reasons? And that's when we got surprised and we ended up with the paper that we have. I haven't done that other one yet. So we did things like we got a data set where we had labeled a clothing data set with existing labels, because like you want to label things for e-commerce and advertising. And we asked one group, okay, is there high skin exposure on this outfit? And let's see, get here, 15 out of 20, for example, said yes, there's high skin exposure on this. Then we said, now let's suppose we have a normative rule that says having high skin exposure is a violation of our dress code. So we tried also then asking, does this outfit violate a dress code that prohibits high skin exposure? These look totally equivalent, right? Logically, they're totally equivalent. But when we asked that question, only 7 out of 20 people said yes. So we were actually thought we were just running a baseline to do our can we design a procedure for recovering reasons. And what we discovered is that when you ask people a normative question, they answer it differently from when you ask what you think is the equivalent factual question. So that's what we set out to study with our human subjects experiment. So we set up a series of 4 experiments where we compared asking, we recruited people on, we recruited people on Mechanical Turk to do 2 types of labeling exercises. In one, which we called our descriptive condition, we just asked people, we'd like you to identify clothing attributes. This is the kind of question you get if you were just labeling that clothing data set. Here are clothing attributes. Does it show high skin exposure, contain text or graphics, contain short shorts or a short skirt? In the normative condition, we said we're evaluating people's opinions on a dress code, on dress code violations. Here's our dress code. The outfit is acceptable unless it shows high skin exposure, has short shorts or a short skirt, or contains text or graphics. You're going to be asked whether or not the outfit violates the dress code. And then we're going to ask you for your reasons, which you see it below. It's just kind of recapturing, is there high skin exposure, is there short shorts or a short skirt? We had 20 labelers per item, 2,000 items for the data set. And 20 labelers per image. Note that's twice any that we saw from those the data sets that are out there. And we did it with 4 different data sets. So we had a dress code, we had a meal code, sort of imagining a school that has a policy for healthy meals for kids. We did it with a pet code, like rules about what kinds of dogs you could have in your apartment. And we did it with a comments context. So with text and a comments code that looked at examples of comments and said, it's not allowed on our community if it has negative comment, is threatening, or uses obscene language. So we asked the descriptive and the normative question in all those settings. I will skip through these. And what we discovered is that this thing that we found kind of casually when we were just trying to do a baseline for this other experiment, we found consistently across all of these settings with these larger samples that the judgment labels differed significantly in those descriptive and the normative conditions. So the way we reach a judgment label, when you do the normative condition, you get the judgment label directly. Is this, or do you judge this to be a violation or not of the relevant code? When we have the descriptive condition, we get, does it have the features that then, according to the logic of the rule, generates a judgment of violation or not? So we construct the judgment label in the descriptive condition and we directly elicit it in the normative condition. And this sort of shows you, this is showing you the percentage of examples of classified as violations in those data sets of 2000 that we started with. And we used a threshold here for these stats here to say it's deemed a violation if under the descriptive procedures, if more than 50% of the annotators label it as containing features prohibited under the code, and it's a violation under the normative if more than 50% of the labelers said it was a violation. We got interested in the fact that, the degree of contentiousness, how close a call is it that this is high skin exposure or not, or these are short shorts or not. Because it's just sort of predicting, well, we shouldn't see much of a difference if it's really clear on the boundaries. So we defined a contentious category just for purposes of reviewing the data, as more than 20% interlabeler descriptive disagreement. So this is just showing you in the percentage of examples with significantly different violations in these different conditions, and separating it out. The dark, the bar to the left in each category here is the overall. The next one is the contentious samples, and the next one is, the third one is the uncontentious examples. And so you can see you've got something ranging from maybe about 5% of the samples show significantly different results on the two different conditions, descriptive and normative. In the meal case, we're getting upwards towards, in the contentious meal cases, upwards close to 70%, showing a significantly different number of violations reached. And it's not explained by the fact we chose 50% as the threshold. So along the bottom axis here is just showing you different thresholds you could choose to determine, okay, are we going to have unanimity that it's a violation, or 80% agreement, or even if one person thinks that's a toxic comment, do we want to say that that's a violation? We looked at that, and up on the vertical axis here is the again, the percent of examples with significantly different labels, and you can see we're still in ranges between 5% to 25%, kind of across all those different thresholds here. We then thought maybe this result is coming from the fact that we've given people context. Like initially we just said, okay, label this as high skin exposure. Maybe just so that, like, you want to know what kind of websites would it be appropriate for them, what kind of search terms might be relevant if somebody's looking for an item of clothing on an e-commerce site. Once you say, oh, it's about dress code, it's about thinking about what somebody could wear to the office or to work. So we decided to also run the experiment looking at what we call descriptive with context. So to give the context, but not the context of judging a violation, just thinking. So for example, in the clothing example, the clothing could be worn in an office or school setting. For the meal, checking whether meals are healthy and wholesome, whether a comment is respectful. And this was a tricky one to come up with the right language for. I'm not sure how we did, but we went back and forth because, we were trying to think about the dogs in the apartments. It was like, well, would not be out of place in a small living place or apartment, right? So trying to see if we could get people thinking, like, in this context, oh, yeah, that's a big dog for a small apartment. Not the same, maybe, as saying, does it violate a rule? And we found that did not change the result. So our result is not coming from the fact we just triggered people to think about what could you wear at work, what kind of a dog could you have in an apartment. In fact, we even got bigger differences in some cases when we added in the context. So you can see, so we found the smallest differences in our clothing case, but descriptive with context, we actually went up in the number that were judged as having that criteria, but the bigger difference than with the normative judgment. And let's see, another one. So again, our meal has high numbers. We get somewhat fewer in the meal case. Okay. All right, so this is just showing you again, we don't probably need to pour over the bar graphs, but again, this is the percent of objects with significantly different violation judgments between conditions. So one of the things you want to think about when you look at that vertical axis, probably too small to read, maybe not so bad. The first marker here is at 10, so 10%. And then, like again, in our contentious meal case, getting up to over 50 when we control for context even. So what I think about there is, if you sent the case to the descriptive procedure for judging, and this is with humans, right? We're just doing this with humans. If you sent it into a descriptive procedure and said, just tell me whether or not the factual predicates of the rule are present, you're going to end up with judgments of significantly more people judged to be in violation of the rule than if you directly ask, is this person in violation of the rule or not? Okay, so the next step in this work was to say, okay, what happens when we train machine learning models on these different kinds of labels? Train on the one hand with those predicting the factual components, or train on the normative labels that directly elicit the judgment. And we found that our models, if you said your accuracy benchmark is against predicting a normative judgment, right, then indeed our models trained on the normative labels achieve higher accuracy. They are better at predicting. When you collect that information, they're better at predicting. So that just shows you that the machine learning application of this directly reproduces what we saw in the experiments, right? The idea that your descriptive labels are not going to do as good a job of predicting what the normative judgment. So again, think about this. Now, if we have the automated system, if we train the automated judgment system on the factual label, which is pretty much how all of our automated decision systems are being built, in the examples we have here, I don't claim you couldn't find communities and you couldn't find judgment context where it might not go the other way. But in the context we have here, you would over-predict violations. So people are going to be treated more harshly with the machine learning model than as against the human judge, which is probably going to, if you get that idea out there, you can say, oh, no, I do not want to be judged by the machine. I want to be judged by the human. And I've got evidence to show that, yeah, there are going to be people for whom machine would find a violation that a human would not find. And then for the machine learning engineers and researchers in the room, we found that this is a bigger effect than other features of model building that we pay a lot of attention to in building our models. So it has a bigger impact than features of your model architecture. The left box here is label noise. We have, let's see what we got here. Yeah, so we've got it represented as in the bottom here, using better data, and instead of using better data on the left versus using a better model. This is a higher capacity model on the right. So adding more parameters, adding more data, and so on. You get a bigger effect on the left than on the right. And that's showing you get a bigger effect from correcting your errors in how you're collecting your labels. Okay, so what does this mean for how we think about automated decision systems and how we should evaluate them and how we should use them? So if the goal is reproducing human judgment, if we're trying to automate human judgment, then it's sort of a straightforward implication. You need to train and evaluate on normative labels. Now, it's not a straightforward thing to do because those are expensive labels, right? All those factual labels are pretty cheap labels. And in fact, there's a lot of data, a lot of models have been built on like the labels we could just find already for other purposes generated on that. That's how we started. That's how we discovered this, because we said, oh, let's run our example, or let's run our model with, or study with a dress code, because it's easy to find labeled clothing data sets that we can access and train on. And getting normative labels means you actually have to pay a lot of attention to how you solicited that label, who you solicited it from, right? We did try and vary the amount of contentiousness, but we weren't doing careful design on that. So you'd want to be doing careful design. In some ways, I think, sort of looking at my social psychology friends in the audience here, it's like all the things we kind of know from doing human subject experiments. We did do a lot of tests, by the way, that tested the order of things, that asking the yes/no question matter. We didn't find that they did. So that means that we need to train and evaluate normative labels, because we've got to collect, pay the money for normative labels, and probably for specific applications. We should be a lot better at documenting that labeling practice. Again, think about the GDPR and Bill C-27 saying you got to be able to get the read. So this should be something that We should be able to critique. You trained your machine learning judgment system, your automated decision system, on the wrong kind of data, right? And so it's not a fair judgment system. And then document that test choice. Okay, so I am done and happy to take questions. Schwartz.
Great talk. That was really interesting. So one question that I started thinking about at the end is the extent to which we want to train machines to make normative judgments, as opposed to attempting to separate the descriptive from the normative. So in many of these cases, we can always sort of like focus on just the factual decision, and then have a human in the loop come subsequently and make the normative judgment. And I sort of can't tell when we would want the normative judgment to be automated and when we should try to avoid it. Like we could always have, okay, well, we'll train the label factually on, you know, is this outfit above the knee or below the knee? Now you as the decision maker, you know, you figure out if that's the rule you want or how you want to state it, but we can kind of, you know, avoid putting the normative part into the labeling process.
So I think this is, and part of I think the way we're pitching this paper is to say, there's a ton of research we need to be doing. We're kind of just casually building these systems and not paying attention. And we're saying that some really important things, and there's lots more important things to pay attention to. But I think what you're getting at is this, you know, this really critical question of how do humans respond to the factual predictions or recommendations from automated systems. Is it sufficient to say, oh, hey, our machine learning model is just predicting the facts and handing it to a human, and a human will still make the same judgment that they would have made without that machine learning prediction, right? Because if we're trying to automate that, now we could have other goals, right? But I want to take that as in this paper, we take that as our goal, is to reproduce human judgment. So it doesn't change anything when we say the human could decide, or we could use the machine learning model properly trained. And I think part of the you know, thinking about this in the compass, the context of that compass of risk and recidivism predictor is, you know, we have reasonably good like suggestion at this point. I don't know if we call it evidence, that once the machine hands the, oh, this is a high risk prediction, that the human doesn't, you know, they then just apply that if then logic directly. And I think this is actually, you know, we didn't study what's the mechanism here, like why are we getting a difference? Because again, you start out thinking, and former law students in the room, and so, you know, this sounds like what we do. If the facts are there, then apply this judgment. I think there's lots of ways to I think we should be doing a lot of work to figure out where that difference is coming from, think about our goals, and then how to control, as well as what the impact is. How does it distort the decision? And I think we've got evidence. I know you work on related questions with explanations. But the way I think about this is say it's a different decision. Even in context, that's why we tested the context, even in context, to say, are these facts met? And in some cases they are, you know, there's subjectivity around the facts. Short skirt, not a short skirt. High skin exposure, not high skin exposure. Smiling, not smiling. I mean, those are subjective judgments. And we resolve that one way when we're just being asked, what are the facts here? And we resolve it differently when we're asked, okay, you're going to point to that person, maybe just in the abstract, and say, you violated a rule. And so I think there's a lot about the way our normative systems work and normative judgment, and what we think of as appropriate normative judgment that operates when we're exercising judgment. So I don't know, maybe there's different parts of our brain that are thinking about this. I sort of think about it, you know, our evaluation on false positives and false negatives could be different in those two contexts, right? That we don't want, if the consequences we're going to point to somebody, and we don't even have like any punishment being delivered here, this is just a label, that, you know, That they, oh, well, but I'm gonna say that person isn't, or that dog is not allowed, whoever prepared that meal violated the rules, that person is violating the dress code. In a close case, I want to call that differently than if you just ask me, would this be appropriate work? You know, I'm not sort of attaching it to a judgment about a person. So I think there's something different going on with the judgment. But the starting, you know, beginning of my answer, long answer, sorry, is yeah, we need. I think it sets out a lot of research questions for us, as well as can you really just give factual predictions and then reproduce the judgment that we'd otherwise have. And I'm going to go to Torin online.
Thank you for that interesting presentation. So this discrepancy between normative judgments and evaluation of objective features is intriguing. I wonder what you think about the prospects of decomposing normative judgments in some other way. For example, here's an idea. Perhaps when people make judgments, normative judgments, they want those judgments to be uncontroversial, to avoid undermining their own authority. And so perhaps to make a judgment the norm has been violated, it's not enough to believe that some objective criteria have been met. They also have to believe that other people would believe that the objective criteria have been met. And so that might naturally set a higher standard. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, yeah, I think that'd be a terrific thing to study. And I don't know if you know the other kind of work that I do, but you know, fundamentally trying to model normative systems is, you know, predicting what would others think, not just like what's my opinion, but rather a rule violation is a collective decision, right? I'm trying to represent the community. Here's what I predict the community would say. I may think that's a short skirt, but I don't think that's a violation of our rule. And I think that's yeah. So I think that's a great thought, and it'd be, yeah, you could study that too, right? Because I know that there are labeling efforts where people certainly there's experiments. There's lots of experiments saying the difference between do you think this is a violation or do you predict that others would think this is a violation? I think some of the efforts to build labels for online comments are exploring that. And it's something I've talked with folks at OpenAI about, you know, thinking about GPT-3 because they're trying to figure out how to label this. And I presented this work to them and to sort of say, you know, you really have to be careful about what question you're asking and not falling into the framework of saying, well, there's a ground truth out there and maybe there's noise. I mean, most of the papers on this that I've seen, scientists are kind of like around that maybe there's noise in the labels, but really, what are you trying to elicit from people? And I like the idea of thinking also about the prediction of what does the community, which could be like, we haven't made that clear. That could be embedded in the question, the normative question that we've asked. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for a really interesting talk, and it's so nice to be here in person. See some faces that I've only seen little boxes. This is like so typical academic, more of a comment than a question. But what your thoughts are on the comment? I think implied in the talk is a mistrust of algorithms and machines. Okay, I think that's warranted. These are new. We don't know how they're going to work. There's all this legislation coming out of Europe, now Canada. But what your talk shows, and what's decades of research in cognitive psychology shows, is that machines are about humans, right? The humans are making judgments that are wrong, they're biased, and you ask them to explain. So yeah, one there's a law about explainability. If you ask about humans, they make stuff up. They'll give you an explanation, but it's probably not why they made their judgment, or at least not all the time. So I mean, it seems like we're in a real conundrum because it's supervised learning, you're basing it on human judgments, which is powerful. And again, you capture that precisely with like the lack of correspondence or the lack of reliability for some judgments more than others, especially like a toxic comment, political hot topic at this point. Anyway, so I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but like, there seems to be implicit that it's kind of lack of trust in machines, but the machines, at least like, it seems to be consistent. And yes, there's a black box element, especially with machine learning, but I think we're getting better at that. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great, because you hit on two really meaty issues for us, subject for us to be studying, questions for us to be exploring. And we do, in the paper we make clear, because we actually would define it as a measurement error. It's a source of measurement error if what you're trying to do is reproduce human decisions, right? Now, as you point out, actually, a lot of the law and psychology research has kind of looked at decision-making in juries and so on. And I did send it off to some of my colleagues, former colleagues at USC, who are real leaders in this field. And that's what they pushed me on. They said, wait a second, we study juries and human decision-making and the lack of coherence between, like if you make the decision here versus there, can you offer the reasons? Are you trying to address cognitive dissonance? If you're asked to judge first in a jury, you're going to see the facts differently. So there's all those things going on. Absolutely. I think the way I think about this from the point of view of this question about how should we build machines, because they are being built. That was part of the point, saying it's going to happen unless you pass a law. It says, no, you can't ever. We tried to do that. I do not think we'll be able to limit it to predictions and recommendations. It's going to be tough. As you say, one of the reasons to do that is for just volume and speed, right? Tons of people get zero adjudication because we don't have enough resources to provide human adjudication. But another is to, with the idea of, can we eliminate the human fallibility in judgment, the fact people are biased, the fact they get tired, they get grumpy, it's late at night, I'm just gonna, flip a coin on what grade to get that paper, never done it. Right, all those things that humans do. So that's one of the attractive ideas about building machines to perform, supplement some of our judgment. I think the point that we're making is that, okay, if we wanted to do that, we didn't know this result was coming in this way, so we didn't craft it like this. But in some sense, we created ideal circumstances for judgment, right? We didn't have many, we were paying people for doing this. As well as you can think about what the incentives are on Mechanical Turk. We tried to make sure we weren't choosing any context that would trigger, the biases, at least that we expected. And then we did have the clothing one. We have in the paper, we report some of the differences between on gender and race, and the comments one could implicate that. And to be honest, that was like the original design. Like we wanted to see if could humans identify biased decision making from by not being able to explain a machine decision with appropriate reasons accepted. So I think what comes out of this is, again, there's lots of, we don't want to say so we shouldn't build machines. I don't think we want to say we shouldn't build machines to do this. But we want to build them in a way that reflects what our ideals are about judgment. And we're just pointing out that it's not that simple. It's not simply just judge the facts, hand it to this group to judge the facts, and then compute the decision. That actually won't reproduce the way humans think about their relationship in judgment. But at the same time, we don't want to just go get judgment labels from I think you don't want to train on the past decisions that judges have made about bail, because we know those judgment labels are distorted. But maybe you want to do the really expensive thing of presenting appropriate decision makers with ideal circumstances to try and elicit those ideal judgments. Your other point about if you ask people to explain, they just make stuff up. So we have lots to talk about on that one. I think it's true we come up with reasons ex post, but I also think that's our control mechanism. That's what law is all about. And they're not just, even if it's not a true causal account, or if we've talked about this absolutely interdisciplinary, I think, even if it's not a true account of what was firing in the decision makers' brain when they made the decision. Our control mechanism is, but they have to be able to offer appropriate, valid reasons for the decision, and we evaluate that, and that's all we can do, because we can't judge what's in their brains, and we need our control. But there's a lot to talk about on that front as well. Let me go to online. Is that Daniel?
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. Appreciate it. And this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, so if it's too much of a tangent, no need to go deep on it. But it just what your talk made me think about kind of like the whole like bias variance thing. That's such a kind of common topic in machine learning in general. But it made me think about it in terms of like the work that you're doing, where if you have a machine decision, then you would assume there'd be less variance, but the risk is that it would be biased versus a human decision. And so I'm just wondering, like, what is actually better, and is it context dependent? Like, if you have a bus that's always 2 minutes late, so it's wrong, it's biased, but there's very low variance, you kind of know what you're getting, versus like a bus that's on average on time. So the average is better, but it's like 10 minutes early, 10 minutes late, it's all over the place. And so, which might be more the case with human decisions, at least in my experience. So yeah, and it is a domain dependent, like as the bus, maybe it's better versus like incarceration or something like that.
Yeah. So again, I'm delighted by these questions, because they're just sort of saying, what are the research topics for us? What should we be studying? It's a great, what's the difference between, like, as sort of a consistently biased in a particular direction versus a on average right but high variance decision, and you call the first one maybe more likely to be machine, more likely to be human than the second. I think that's something testable here. I mean, part of what we were wondering is sort of as follow-on work, would it be possible to take the machine that was trained on the factual labels, which we've shown has a consistent bias, and that's what our surprise was. I really predicted we would see it go in different directions, or that it would be kind of specific to the particular context. And I have no trouble coming up with examples where people would say, no, we want to go in the other direction, but that's to be tested. Could you build that model and then correct it, like fine tune it or something, for getting closer to that ideal human judgment, not the biased human judgment? So can we what's that ideal, right? More reliable, valid decisions, judgments that are reflecting the intention of our rules. Like the intention of our rules are that people get bail unless they pose excessive risk of reoffense. That's what we capture in our legal language. And so I think that again, just more to be studied. So I'm not really taking a position on should we prefer human to machine judgment. I'm thinking about what's the best way to train those machines, assuming you think we should do that at all. I hope that addresses it.
Justice of peace, which is like the entrance level, I think, for legal system, more or less, much of the time, don't have to be lawyers. And I mention that because obviously the connotation is that if you have a superbly developed machine that can adjudicate on its own, okay, let's presume we have that. We won't necessarily want to have that, because the consequences might be, well, unintended consequences, or even intended, that you'd have such a volume of case law generated by the machine that benefit, one thing that might be a benefit, would be all the administrative and simple civil, low-level, high-grade, like very straightforward stuff could be dealt with by the machine, and that may and should free up the regular trial judges to start examining stuff that they say, we don't have time to do this in court. And they won't even say anything.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. That's one common question, because from what you said today, your focus is on micro, what's the legally sustainable path, what evidence might be sustainable, that's essentially generated by the machine through its ability to distinguish, collate, and to categorize, etc. When I'm looking at something much bigger, that's presumed it's very successful and it's socially accepted and it's economic, of course, and politically acceptable. What will the consequences? for the judicial system in general and for the nature of justice.
Yeah. So I think those are great questions. Let me just and great, thoughts about how do we think about how we build these systems. And if nothing else, that's the thing that we want to put on the table is there's a lot more to thinking about how to do these systems than I think is reflected in our current practices. So point number one, so a lot of the work that I've done in my career has been focused on the question of access to justice and really recognizing that we don't actually produce systems that implement anything close to what our complex, fairly fancy legal systems do. So like literally the numbers are 95%. I know the New York numbers really well because I was citing them in some work. 95% of people facing an enforcement action for debt collection have no lawyer. 98% of people being evicted from housing have no lawyer in New York courts. And the numbers, if you go downtown Toronto, 70 to 80% of people in custody and family matters have no lawyer. In small claims court, I think the average, if you get in there, is 5 minutes per case. But that's the volume of cases that are being decided. So I think it is really important to think about, gosh, if we could get some adjudication of some set of claims, that could, as you say, you could free up judges and courtrooms for matters that we think require more human attention. But you also said something I really want to pick up, and I should have said it as well in response to Daniel's question. And that is, you use the concept of what's socially acceptable. I think you said, let's assume it's all socially acceptable. But I think that's actually the question that we're asking is, we need to ask that question. And I think not only from the point of view of what's a logically correct application of our rules, right? That, to approach it from the point of view, what would be a faithful application of our rules, to recognizing that our systems of rules are the mechanism we use to be comfortable living together in this complex, interdependent environment. Our institutions for resolving disputes between us are ones that secure, if they're effective, and they establish stable social thriving systems, they satisfy that. It really doesn't matter whether it's like accurate or not. It's like, what is it that people require in order to say, I'm willing to, be in a building I had nothing to do with building. I'm going to eat food that I don't know how it was prepared. I'm going to go to work for somebody and I don't know what practices they're going to engage in. What makes me comfortable and invest my money, borrow money, right? Send my kid to a school, send them to camp. All those things that we do are a function of our level of confidence, and hopefully it's warranted confidence in the systems we have for making judgments about, sorry, there was a rule about how you're supposed to prepare that food. There was rules about how you're supposed to take care of the children. There was rules about what you can ask your employees to do and not ask them to do. And I think it's important to be thinking about that. So when I look at the difference between the normative judgment and the descriptive judgment, I say there's something else going on in that normative judgment that I think is capturing that this is, we're thinking about what would be the right, fair way for this kind of a system to operate. But I think that the question of what's socially acceptable is really, in some ways, it's core. Like I don't want to say, oh, you can get away with anything you want. Just, it's a bit like talking about trust in machine learning and AI. You don't want to say, oh, we just want to get people to trust it, not worry about whether it's actually trustworthy, right? Or warranted trust. We need to get into those because people will figure it out eventually. But I think that's actually the core thing we're trying to think about when we design these systems, right? Am I going to go in and think about Boris and work on the medical system and doctors, right? Do I trust going into the hospital that, if they're using these machines, if they're getting recommendations that they've been, properly trained, well reviewed, well regulated, and so on. So, let's see who's next here. Brian.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. So many questions, Gillian, and I'll try to ask just one. You said that you control for Well, you were talking about context and whether the word means different things in different contexts, and so you tried to control for context. But it seems to me the very distinction between description and judgment is context, and that therefore, I mean, the context of somebody, showing too much skin or whatever, it's not that it's possible to actually have there be a fact about whether there's, this shows skin or is this or that, independent of the sort of normative context in which that decision is made. And in fact, there's a lot of philosophy that argues that predicates and properties and so on and so forth are in fact normatively laden, all the way down. There's no extraction of them. That would seem in some ways to make your task harder, but it seems to me there's one way to interpret it, which is sort of simplifies things, which is, look, if somebody were to argue, like me, for example, that these systems aren't themselves capable of making judgments, that all we're trying to do is, if we want to do it at all, and I'm dubious, but that's okay. I think we all might be dubious, but it's likely to happen. So if we want to train these systems such that we can interpret their actions as in fact outputting things which we will then take to be judgments that we're going to make, if in fact these things like context and Lord knows how many other things are all part of the context, then what you want to do is train these systems as close as possible to the context in which they're going to be used. I mean, just be as close as possible. Any kind of training at all, if context is sort of unimaginably rich, then the closer you can get to the point of application. If you can get a machine learning thing trained there, the more likely it is to be able to mimic what we would do. And so that would suggest you're getting the more expensive normative context and so on. We don't have to actually have a theory of all that. Just train as close as possible to the point of application. And that would actually do a fair amount of work, it seems to me, in implementing the sort of more difficult philosophical reasons for that.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Brian, and we'll get to all those other questions over, I hope, lunch or coffee soon, now that we all could be back.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yep.
So a couple of thoughts here. So I appreciate your point that blockers or people thinking about judgment as you have been. The idea that it's normative all the way down. All facts are sort of context specific. And so it's not that surprising a result to say if you're trying to replicate judgment, you should train closer to the context. I mean, this is always the part of the reason I set the paper up by saying we were surprised by this result. Now, maybe you would have caught it had we had the early conversation and said, oh, you're going to find the following. So I should have just talked to you sooner. But I think it's a natural thing to think. So I appreciate that. So maybe just that philosophical point hasn't been recognized. So I appreciate that, and I still think it's important that to have demonstrated this with human subjects testing so that we can. But the second is you sort of said, well, doesn't that obviously imply we should train as close as possible to the actual context? And now I'm going to be a lawyer and an economist and say, no, because that's, like I said, it's more expensive to get these, right? And what we are trying to do is solve some economic and legal problems, which is we actually need our rule systems and our adjudication systems to work well in order to maintain stability and produce all the wonderful things, whether it's rights protection or productive economies. Again, sort of thinking as an economist, say, well, no, it's costly, therefore you don't want to go as close as possible. You want to get to the optimal level of, balancing off the costs and the benefits of that. So I think we do need to characterize what is this gap, and we need to be studying that gap, and we need to be studying it against the benchmark, not only of what is theoretically correct, right? Not what would, was it the angels dancing on the head of a pin, right? This has been my critique of our legal system for 25 years since I had to pay some high legal bills, which was, we've set this thing up to say the goal is to get to the absolutely correct interpretation of that word in this contract or statute. And the cost of that is that 95% of people don't get access at all, because we've created such an incredibly expensive system that we haven't, here's the economist, we haven't optimized very well. So I know that the economist point is not going to be probably particularly attractive to you, Brian. But I hear you on the call.
I'm not sure anyone has ever accused me of being economic, but but I do think there's a research question there, which is, I mean, I appreciate your point. It's not
Yeah.
and what it would be for us to have a comprehension of the kinds of distance these systems are from their point of application and what kinds of costs come with what kinds of distance,
Yes.
such that we can assess particular tasks and sort of say, well, look, in this case, this is really important. And in this case, that system is too far away from the point of application. And so therefore, the net stretch is too much and so on. That's what sort of competence in this area would be, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, terrific. So I actually think we are, you're not the economist, I'm not the philosopher, but I think we're actually quite close on this point to say we do need to characterize what that gap is. And then when we're thinking about what's the gap, it's not just what's the theoretically correct interpretation or assessment of, is that short shorts or short skirt, or and it's not purely a prediction. Oh, this is going back to Torrin's question. Maybe it's not purely a prediction of what the community would do, but it's ultimately about the role that these systems are playing in the stability of our societies. And so we don't want to be cynical about that and say it's just about, keeping the masses happy with enough adjudication, right? We have ideals about that. We also have criteria for what people are willing to accept. We're all, well, those of us who also have an American passport, I guess, are all upset about what's happening with the US Supreme Court and saying, oh my gosh, like we're losing just the capacity for this institution that we want to be deciding in a non-political way, highly political questions. So I think there's lots to explore there, but that I appreciate your sort of bringing out, yes, this is also so many great research questions today. Paying close attention to that gap as we build these systems. I think that's really, really important. Hey,
Yes. Hi, Gillian. So I think that's a great setup for my question, which is I like the result we have that the judgment labels cannot always be inferred from descriptive labels. I think they're very nice to say. I guess my question is twofold. One is, do you think there are some domains where that is possible and others where there aren't? And do you have an intuition as where there are, what those are? And then second is, even if you don't or do you think there's a mechanical way that we could infer or figure out what those domains are? If we had some set of accurate judgment labels over the same samples where we have descriptive labels, and then we can do some analysis or even train a model to see how accurate it can be. It could be that there's not enough descriptive labels, or you need other labels that you can add, or maybe you just have the right model, I don't know. But do you think that could be one way to kind of pull that one? Because I like the idea of getting those expensive labels without having to pay for them.
Yeah, I know, yeah. So I don't have any intuitions about domains where you might not find this difference. Not because I think there can't be any, but because my current way, like I say, we didn't test the mechanism. So that's like more research. Given the work I do about sort of maintaining the stability of normative equilibria, I think of it as it's just it's a different kind of judgment. There's a different thing going on in the brain when you're asked to judge, is there a violation or not? Maybe if you were judging a violation by an organization and a corporation or something, maybe that would be a place I would look to see if we saw differences where there wasn't the same kind of interpersonal, relational. So we didn't look at that. So we're not sure about the domain. But on the second point of, could we perhaps figure out how to basically predict that gap? And then if you could build the model of the gap, and let's suppose it is because we have different weights on false positives and negatives in the judgment case, and they're this, we kind of equally, we weight them equally in the factual case, and we put greater weight on the false positive in the in the normative case, then maybe we could build a model that would predict that difference. That, you know, there certainly was a level of consistency we saw in this result that kind of surprised us. That was like, you know, okay, but could you then kind of correct for this? But then I want to say, but I want to make sure you have a test procedure, a test set that is, okay, now you're going to go to human and you're going to test against human judgment. If what you're trying to do is say to people, you will only be better off if you're judged by the machine, not worse off. And this is, you'd be worse off, like what we're saying, if you're trained on the descriptive labels, you're going to be worse off because the machine is not even capturing ideal human judgment. Yeah, right. So maybe there's a more expensive, but not quite as expensive procedure that we could use. I'm going to go online. I know we just got a couple of questions, so I'll take the online one, and then, because Lynette, I think I could get your call, okay, Eleanor.
Hi, thank you so much for this brilliant talk. My question is about where you see the role of the public in all of this, because I don't recall anybody electing or voting to say, let's have our judges use a machine learning algorithm. And similarly, it would be difficult to sort of have from the ground up, a demand for, publish the data sets this was trained on. So what is your recommendation to better involve the public in whether we use these machine learning models at all, let alone accountability for them?
So two thoughts about that. And the first is just to kind of be particular about it. The public is involved in the decision to use these because elected representatives and people appointed, like we elected representatives, members of parliament, we've got appointees and employees in federal agencies operating under legislation. So in a sense, that's how the public is getting represented in that question. We're also seeing the public represented in the fact that GDPR early on, like the first bit of regulation around how AI is used, is saying, hey, if you're going to start making decisions about us, it was focused on the data, but it included this idea that was captured with the idea of explanation. But what really was being captured there was, I have to be able to challenge the machine decision in the way that I can challenge the human decision. And so we need to build that system. And I think that piece is in there. Now, but the other side of this, to think about how does the public, how does the ordinary person get involved, is actually something I think it's really critical for us to be thinking about. And even if we think about that labeling, maybe that's a set of processes that we should be creating where we are regularly going into the public. Now, you're asking to say, should we use it or not? And that'll be the politics around it, right? Like the EU AI Act, also principles about human oversight. The US AI Bill of Rights just came out, or the proposed blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. A key point is human oversight, human in the loop. So we're seeing that idea that the public should be involved. I'd like to also be thinking, maybe this was the comment earlier about micro, maybe we should have processes that kind of look like the way we decide cases. I've been talking to people at Schwartz Reisman recently about the idea of AI juries, right? Maybe we currently go through the community when we have hard cases and we put it in front of a judge, we put it in front of a jury, more so in the US with the jury. And that's how we resolve hard cases about trade-offs. So are there ways we should be thinking about incorporating that regularized role for ordinary people, workers, people who are likely to be in court, et cetera, to really weigh in on what is it that we want of automated decision systems? And I'd like to get that question to a more nuanced place than saying, either we don't want them, we can't have them. I think that's going to be extremely hard to get to, because I don't think you'll be able to draw the line that Boris was sort of asking us about, but I think it's a research question. Oh, they'll just recommend, they'll just predict the facts, and then humans will make the decision. But if we're going to head in the direction of, then I think that's like the tides are there, then I think we want to be much, much more thoughtful about exactly, I think, what you're thinking about, which is, hey, I didn't ask to be judged by a machine. Okay, so let's figure out, what does it have to do? Is there a process that makes you feel comfortable? Because you're getting judged by a bunch of processes already. that don't give you what you think you're getting, right? You know, you're getting 5 minutes from a judge, or you're getting an immigration hearing where you don't have a lawyer. We are at the end of our regular time. So should we call it so that people can leave, and then I will be around and very happy to answer more questions. Sheila, I'll pass it over.
So I don't get to ask my question, but I'll come forward. So thank you, Gillian, for a very interesting talk, and thank you to everybody who came here to join us in person for our first SRI seminar. It's really great to see all of you here. Thank you to the people online who joined us. I'll be interested to hear after the fact how, sorry, wherever the camera is, what your experience was like. I wanted to make a couple of announcements before we call it a day. The first is that our next seminar will be back online on Wednesday, October 26th, and it will feature Micah Bernstein from Stanford University, who will be speaking about designing artificial intelligence to navigate societal disagreement. So you can go to the SRI website as usual to register for that event. I also wanted to mention one other really exciting event that's going to happen next week. So on Tuesday, October 25th, SRI will host a talk by Anna Goldenberg. It's the inaugural lecture in our Women in AI seminar series, which is organized in collaboration with Deloitte. So thank you to Deloitte for that. And just a bit, Anna's a professor at U of T in the Department of Computer Science. She also has an appointment at the Laboratory of Medicine and Pathobiology department. She's a Varma Family Chair in Biomedical Informatics and AI at Sick Kids Research Institute, and she's also a CFAR Canada AI Chair. Her talk, which again is going to be on Tuesday morning, will discuss the increasing role of machine learning in healthcare decision-making. So a nice follow-on to, I think, some of the topics that Gillian has been talking about, but very much in the area of healthcare. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. So thank you again. And thank you again to join us.